When we take a look at the animation of our walk cycle, it can be a little overwhelming at times, trying to figure out how we're going to construct all of these shapes and how to draw our character to produce this sense of movement, this sense of locomotion. However, it gets a little bit easier once you start looking at each of the individual keyframes. Each keyframe serves a very direct purpose, and once we start slowing down the movement and dissecting all of these individual poses, constructing a walk cycle gets a little bit easier. So here's the final finished result, a loopable animation. It's pausing just because of the presentation software, but if it's designed just to loop over and over and over again. There are 25 frames that we're going to be focusing on to create a 1-second walk cycle. There are 24 individual pictures in 1 second of film, and we're going to draw 25 frames. We'll get back to why we draw 25 frames here in a minute. But we're going to focus all of our energy on these 25 frames, and not all of them are going to have the same attention given to them. There's only a handful of keyframes that we really need to start to decode. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here are all of the keyframes for our walk cycle laid out in a straight line. And you can see the patterns start to emerge and unfold in front of us. You can already see when we take all of the keyframes, normally these drawings would be stacked on top of each other, but I've taken them and I've spread them out across the width of the picture just so we can see what each individual keyframe looks like on its own. If you look carefully here, you can already get a good sense of the wave, the arc that the head has. You can already see a good sense of the hips as it goes through its wave. It's pretty neat. If you track the rotation of the ankles themselves, they also create their own movement arcs. It's really neat to see these arcs in practice and in play when we start spreading out all of these keyframes across the width of the image itself. Now, more importantly than the arcs are how the character is going to be posed. And if you look very carefully here, especially at the legs, you'll see a pattern start to emerge. Look carefully here. And specifically, I want you to start comparing the drawings that you see here to the drawing that you see here on frame 13. And then lastly, here on frame 25, the last frame of our animation. If you look carefully, these three pictures, the characters posed identically. And specifically, check this out, we have a drawing here on frame 1, and if you compare it to what we see over here on frame 25, they are fundamentally the exact same thing. When we're establishing our keyframes for all of our walk cycles, the first frame and the last frame are going to be identical. We're not going to include this 25th frame inside the final animation. If we were to do so, we'd have two frames that look identical, and you'd see a noticeable stutter, a noticeable jitter, and it pauses just for a brief 1/24th of a second. So this one is just a utility frame that eventually we're going to ignore. We create the 25th frame so that we have a target for the 24th frame. Without that target, it's going to be very difficult to create a loopable animation that's smooth and can be repeatable over and over and over again. So the pose of our characters on frame 1, 13, and 25 is identical. On frame 13, however, this is the middle part of the walk cycle itself. This is when our legs physically switch positions. What was the trailing leg is now the leading leg. What was the leg that was taking the step is now serving as the pivot point and the anchor for the remainder of the walk cycle. So if you look carefully here, on the first part of the walk cycle, the white leg is serving as the anchor. It's the leg that gets stuck to the ground, okay? And then the gray leg is the one that's physically taking the step forward and propelling our character forward in movement. And then that role swaps on the back side of our walk cycle. Now, on the back side, check it out. The gray leg is serving as the anchor, and the white leg is the one that's physically taking the step. So we're going to have a complete cycle here. The goal is to have our character do one complete step itself for each leg. In the first part, the white leg is going to be the one that's going to be the anchor. The gray leg is going to be taking the step. And then on the back side, so all of this, the gray leg is going to be the anchor, and the white leg is going to be the one that's taking the step. The posing of our character, though, is identical. If you really look at the angle of our legs, check it out. Here's a great example, Check it out. Here's a great example. Check out the pose of this character on frame 4 and then again on frame 14 or 16, excuse me. It's identical to each other. So the poses on the first half are the same on the second half. Just the colors of the legs are different because we've taken a step in there. And again, if you look carefully, if you take that idea into play, all we have to do is focus our energy on these frames in here. Because if we can nail these frames, we've done it. Because then we can just copy and paste the drawings for the latter half of the animation, and we're good to go. Even more so, if we just focus our energy on these frames in here, with the idea that 1, 13, and 25 are identical to each other, now we have something that we can manage. Really what we're doing is we're focusing all of our creative energies on 4 drawings. 1, 4, 7, 10. 1, 13, and 25 are all identical. If we can get these 4 drawings done in here, we pretty much have the foundation for the rest of our walk cycle. Okay, let's take a look at the purpose of each one of these poses, because they all have a defined value inside of the scene itself. Each one of these critical keyframes has a very important function inside the larger context of the animation itself. And let's talk about what that context is. First up is the contact pose. Now the contact pose is found on frames 1, 13, and 25. And this is the first pose that we're going to draw. If you look at this pose, and we're not going to do the arms in this animation, we're just going to focus on the body and the legs. If you look at the posing of our character, we're starting to do a couple things. This is where we establish the stride length in the contact pose. Now, as one might imagine, it's called the contact pose because we are physically touching the ground with both feet in this one pose. This is one of the few frames in the entirety of the walk cycle where both feet are going to be on the ground at the exact same time, thus the name, the contact pose. It also starts to establish pretty quickly the location of the hips and where the curve, the arc for the hips is going to rise and fall. This is kind of the middle point of the arc. It's not the lowest, and it's certainly not the highest. This establishes kind of the baseline, if you will. I often draw my contact poses and then make some adjustments to the contact pose as I start to develop the rest of the poses in the walk cycle. So this is usually a pose that you're going to want to come back and edit once you've started to define how the character is going to compress and expand on the down, passing, and peak pose. Speaking of those other poses, let's start taking a look at some of the other poses. So once we've established the contact pose, then we go to frame 4, and we start looking at what's called the down pose. As one might imagine, it's easy to discover here. The down pose is when we compress the spring. This is when our character's hips is at the bottom of our movement arc. Okay? If you notice, it's way down here, thus the down pose. In addition, the other things that I like to focus on when looking at the down pose is creating a really nice bend in this foreground leg. This bend really helps our audience understand that the mass is compressing, that we are shrinking, if you will, and then expanding as we go into the next poses. The back leg also has its toe trailing on the ground, suggesting that we are about to take a step. For me personally, the down pose is the one that I often spend the most energy on. It really sets up the rest of the poses, and a good strong down pose is really going to help creating the next 2 poses a little bit easier. Speaking of which, let's continue on. Let's go in and start looking at what the next frames are. Here's frame 7, and this is the next major pose of our walk cycle animation. This is called the passing pose, and simply it's called the passing pose because what was the back leg, this gray guy, is now passing in front of the anchor leg, this guy. So this is where the feet physically start to swap their locations inside of our movement cycle itself. If you look carefully at how the body's posed, there's a couple things in here that are important to point out. We have a very strong plank sense with the mass of our character. Notice that the heel of the foot, solid, locked to the ground, way down here at the bottom. This is supposed to give us a sense of a tremendous amount of stability in the movement itself. We need to provide this sense of stability for our audience so that they believe that the passing foot can actually move without our character, as one might imagine, falling over and face planting on the concrete. So having a nice strong leg here is super important. If this was bent, it would make it feel a little bit more unstable. If the angle of the back and the neck was at a really strange angle like this, then it's going to start to feel like the character is just going to fall over. So having a strong plank here is a good place to go. Please point out that this is not a perfectly straight up and down line. It's not perfectly vertical. This is at a small angle, and I'm going to mess it up, but I want you to just kind of note that there's an angle in here. It's not perfectly straight. And we want to have a small little lean, not a huge lean, but just a small little lean forward so that our audience feels like this character is translating, that it's physically moving forward in the scene. Now, the passing pose is a setup pose for my most favorite pose in the entire system itself, and that one's called the peak pose. Now, the peak pose is supposed to give our audience a sense of energy, and if you look carefully here, check it out. We're springing forward into the scene itself. We have this wonderful separation of the heel down here at the ground, and the distance between the top of the foot and the ground suggests that we are physically taking a step, that we are moving forward in this peak pose. As you also might have discovered so far, it's called the peak pose because our hip is at the highest inside of its global movement arc. This peak pose gives us energy, and it serves as a contrasting moment to the next pose itself. Like all waves, we have a peak and a trough, right? We have it way up here at the top, at the peak of our wave, and then the trough is down here at the bottom. In order for their audience to understand this movement along this wave itself, that we are physically going down the roller coaster hill, we need to have a contrasting pose, which is why we have the next pose inside of our major key frames that we're looking at, which is going to be another contact pose. So the peak is the highest, and then we got to come back down into the contact pose. As you probably have already seen and discovered, that peak pose does a really great job at establishing the hips, right? Because if that's the location of the hips on the peak, it goes down, if you will, towards the contact, and then it goes down even more into that down pose. We have a movement arc that looks something like this. It's pretty cool to start crafting these little waves. So this contact pose right in the middle of our animation sequence does a great job at grounding our character. It provides the conclusion of that movement arc inside of the frame or inside of the animation. Now, if we focus all of our energy on these 5 key frames, we've done it. Because as I mentioned before, the first half of the walk cycle is identical to the second half of the walk cycle. Use these ideas as a guide when crafting your own walk cycle for this animation. We want to have these poses in tow. These poses define the DNA of the movement. In addition, they also provide a framework for working on any animation. You go into any animation studio around the world, they're going to be talking about contact, down, passing, and peak frames. These frames, this vocabulary is part of our craft as animators, and they really define moments in time for all characters in all movements. So focus your energy on the first stage and defining how your character is going to be utilizing these poses to define their local animation of their walk.